My father would drive me out. He was incident. My father was sometimes here, sometimes not here. He was really gone from the time I was about 4, but he'd show up from time to time and take me out for a ride in the car with a rumble seat. But we'd drive out towards Newark Airport, and it was called Shantytown. And there would be a couple of acres of tents, and you'd see little bonfires, and there were men who had left their homes or they couldn't support their families, and they weren't vagrants because they lived there. And these were people who didn't have any money, and they had shame. There was a lot of shame. The Depression, if there's another word to use to describe it, was fraught with shame.
Times were so bad for everybody, and so we were no different. I remember at one time my mother said to my father, he was a cab driver, "There's no milk on the table. Why don't you go out and hack? Bring in some money." He says, "Nobody's getting in taxis these days. They can't afford it." She says, "Go out, hold up a bank." My father went out. An hour and a half later, he came back, he threw a quarter on the table. He said, "Here, buy some milk." He started to cry. And my mother would sit there and look at him someday, watching him smoke a cigar. She said, "Who do you think you are with the cigar? Rockefeller?" She came over and she broke the cigar. From that point on, my father smoked a pipe.
All comedy comes out of tragedy, which is, it's a shock. It's a social shock. And it's a terrible thing for people to just have the rug pulled out. But that's when human creativity sprouts. It's forced. Have to do something about this. Gotta eat. So where do we start?
They used to say, my father couldn't work. They called that stock lines. Everybody used the same line. He couldn't work. There was no food in the house. We couldn't pay the rent. And the landlord was going to dispossess us. And then came the Depression. And people laughed. It was created from that period.
New York, October 1929. Everything was calm and peaceful in this great city. Then suddenly the bottom dropped out of Wall Street. But were the brokers discouraged? No. They knew prosperity was just around the corner. Some preferred white bread, some whole wheat, others rye. The birds had little choice.
I was born an orphan. I didn't have any home. So I was one of the kids who grew up coming out of absolute poverty. I didn't have any future. I didn't know what I wanted to be. So I started hitchhiking across the country to see what would happen. This was in 1929, in June 1929. And I hitchhiked up the coast to Walla Walla, Washington. And then I wanted to cross the Rockies, and that was tough on hitchhiking, so I started becoming a hobo on railroads. I rode freight trains across the country, always kept going. I had no money whatsoever with me, maybe $5. And every time there was a job offered, I took it, whether I knew what to do with it or not.
$2 a day for this. All I have to do is walk up and down and turn the light on and off.
This your regular job?
No, I don't believe in regular jobs. I do this for a friend of mine. I sub for him on his night off.
And all you got to do is walk up and down here?
That's all.
Is it all right if I walk up and down with you?
Sure, it's a free country, isn't it?
I got to New York. I was sleeping in the YMCA gym in Brooklyn, and there was a job open as a typist. And I was on Wall Street, and I was working away at it every day in August and July and Then along came October, and this was the great turning point of my life. On October 29th, 1929, the Depression, the Great Depression, started. And they couldn't keep up with the way the markets were falling and prices were changing. You couldn't sell your stock even if you wanted to and you knew it was going down because you couldn't get the message through. Everything was jammed. The people in the office at the National City Bank in New York where I worked were all crying because they'd all invested all of their savings on Wall Street. Wherever you looked, boys and girls were, men and women, were wondering what was ever going to happen to them. And I was wondering a little about it, but I was wondering that since the time I was born, so I had an advantage over the rest of them.
Contending with modern economic difficulties requires quite as high courage and as much enterprise as was displayed by men and women of covered wagon days.
I was born in Brooklyn, New York, on a boarding house table, and my father had come from Glasgow, Scotland, was in the First World War, and he became a comic, and I stayed in burlesque at the time. People wanted to laugh. There was nothing to laugh about, and they got together and said, let's have a burlesque show. I said, what's that? These gags and dance group and this and that. My mother brought me to California. She in a broken down car, and she said, I've got a feeling my son wants to be something. So we traveled, and there were no motels or anything. We slept on dirty mattresses. It wasn't easy. And no roads, no maps. Are we on the way to California? I think it's down that way. You know, it was rough on my mother.
I remember being born, so I have a total recall of all of my life. When I was 19 years old, I went to the Greyhound bus to get on the bus. I looked in the United Cigar Store window, and there was a copy of a book there called Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. I bought Grapes of Wrath, got on the bus, and rode through the Dust Bowl on Highway 66. Reading about it in the book was something, and Steinbeck spoke to me. So when I wrote the Martian Chronicles, I borrowed the ideas for the Martian Chronicles from the Grapes of Wrath.
I remember trying to think about how I could take my bicycle and how I could put some wings on the sides of it and maybe get a little bit of lift as I pedaled along. And of course I built cockpits out of orange crates and cans and things that resembled the throttle. And here I'd never even been in an airplane, but it was kind of make-believe. And in those days you listened to the shadow and the creaking door, and you didn't have the imagination stolen from you by the visuals of television. You had to imagine all these things.
The thing that was amazing about the times, and we'll never see them again, was that people were, in my opinion, heroically passive. They just took whatever life handed them. They obeyed the law as much as possible, except when it came to feeding their families. Then they would steal, or they would do anything that they had to do to survive.
I remember stealing food to bring home. I remember looking behind the markets, the garbage cans, looking for like head lettuce that still had some good leaves on them. We did those things to stay alive. And my father took off. My mother remarried, and and a stepfather who was had that kind of ethic that the man worked. You know, the woman cooked, the man worked, and there was no work. There was no work, and that impacted on him, and he turned just vicious, suffering from that. So the whole family unit suffered in so many ways.
The Great Depression of the 1930s is not just another commodity bubble or price bubble. The reason it was so deep and lasted so long is because there was a convergence of so many things happening. There was the great bubble in stock prices, of course, in the 1920s, and that's what causes the stock market crash. But we've seen stock market crashes of kind of comparable proportions without the ensuing great economic chaos. So there's something more and deeper at work here in the 1930s. And to be honest about it, economic historians do not agree to this day about exactly what happened.
I remember when the banks closed in '32, and my mother called my brother and me in. We were out playing in the yard. She said, "I have bad news." And I thought maybe a cherished relative had died or something. And she said, "The banks have closed, and you will not see the money that you have in the bank anymore, because we'll probably never get it back."
We didn't have Social Security. We didn't have a lot of the things that people have today, to guide them through rough times. So it was, you were totally on your own.
I was about 11 years old, 1936, when a lot of people came to California from Oklahoma in that, the Dust Bowl. But growing up in the area, some of our friends, we like to say we were poor, but we didn't know it because everybody was poor.
I think maybe the Okies made it because of sheer determination. But if you didn't have any money and you didn't have a car, and you didn't have how were you going to make that move? It was too tough. Although I do know one family who made it very successfully in Canada, and they told me stories of how they piled, I think, 5 or 6 kids, the mother and the father in the car, with all their earthly belongings, with frying pans and stuff hanging from the sides of the car, just like the Okies did. And they stopped off in little places, and eventually one son was deposited in Regina, another one in Saskatoon, another one in Calgary. They each tried to make their own way in various parts of Canada. It was, Charles Dickens once wrote, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Believe me, it was the worst of times.
People were walking around without eating. There's no need to talk history of what happened in terms of the very famous rich who, what happened to them. But the real, you felt like the country was going down,
We lost our house in 1933 and were thrown out on the street. And it certainly is one of the most awful moments of my life ever. And my father was not a worldly man. When everybody was making money in the stock market, and people were saying, "Gee, Joe, what do you do with your money?" I got it. He was keeping it in the house, hidden. And I said, that's crazy. Your house could burn down. Invested. Well, he didn't know. So he invested. In 1928, I think he invested in an electric bond and share in Anaconda Copper. And of course, he bought on the margin, as everybody did. That's what they thought that was the way to do it. And they were encouraged to do it by the brokers. And when everything collapsed, we lost everything, and then my father was never the same man. And we were having lunch, and a man that they knew, the man at the bank who handled the mortgages, came in, and he said, "What are you people doing here?" And my mother said, I'm not going to mention his name because he still has family in Wilkes-Barre. My mother said, "Mr. X, we're having our lunch. Would you like to sit down and have something to eat?" And he said, "You can't have lunch here. This is not your house. This is my house." My father by this time was just gone. And my mother said, my mother's a very strong woman, very brave woman. And she said, "Well, Mr. X, it's our house. We live here. It's our house. He said, look, it's not your house. And he went, and he spit on the rug. And with that, I mean, everybody the family just collapsed, and we were herded out of the house. Our furniture was taken out. Everything was taken out of the house, put on the street, most of which disappeared shortly thereafter. We went, my mother had a sister who was married to a very decent man who was an old socialist and didn't believe in the stock market or, profiting by anybody else's labor. And he had a small furniture store in West Pittston, Pennsylvania. And we went to live with them.
I grew up in the Depression, but when you have nothing to contrast it with and all your neighbors are living the same way, you don't know you're in a Great Depression or even a mild depression. But one of our saving graces, and I think this is true of many people around that time in a rural or a semi-rural area, we had a very big garden, which was twice as big as our house. And we raised a whole lot of vegetables. And so all summer, we're living out of the garden. And in a sense, food is free in that way. We raised chickens. We had 25 chickens. We didn't kill them very often because then you don't have as many eggs. And one of my chores was to gather all the eggs, which happened daily. And the family couldn't eat more than 6 or 8, 10 eggs a day. And so we would give them to neighbors, and it wasn't like, I'll give you this if you give me that. It was just, here, take some eggs. And at other times, they bring you milk, if they had a cow. That's how these programs work in the third world countries, where they give a family a goat, and that's not just, they have milk, they get enough milk for neighbors. And in that way, they can barter for other things, and sometimes even start a small business, like a little dairy or something.
Curiosity and challenge is what I think this work ethic produced. You had to move on, and you had to be creative. You had to have a creative mind.
Well, things looks pretty tough. But it ain't gonna be this way all the time.
The Depression was a depression in the physical, economic sense, but in the social and the cultural and the spiritual sense, it was a stimulation.
Struggle and strife and trauma and tragedy are great sources of our greatest strengths. And one way is that in current evolutionary thinking, our basic social tendencies to cooperate, to trust, to sacrifice and to give are a product of our collective sociality responding to struggle and threat, right? And so when we enter into historical times where there is resource deprivation or there are threats, it turns that on, and people feel routinely, in the Great Depression or during wartime or during, economic troubles, people feel immediately this bonding tendency that's a great product of times of strife.
Even now, we are not so much divided as we are disconnected. If we just get power comes from connection. Plugging in and you receive power. So I enjoy connecting. I have 106 godchildren, including the president. He is one of my godchildren. 106. You know why? Because I listen. I pray with them. I talk with them. I give them directions. We got to go back to being parents. My daddy just didn't, and mama didn't raise me. Everybody in my community raised me.
I remember you. In those days, people would help each other. If this person had something you didn't have, you trade it for it or give it to her, And, that really brings out the best in people. I opened my first official gym in Oakland in 1936. See, I was the first one to have women working out with the weights. I was the first one to have old people working out with the weights. I was the first one of athletes working out with the weights. The word got around. That Jacqueline, he's a nut. He's a crackpot, you know. Got women working out with the waist. Got athletes working out with the waist. The athletes will get muscle bound. The old guys will drop a heart attack. You can't believe what I went through, boy. It was tough. Not only to open the first gym and everything, but then going through the depression. So people had no money. But that's how I started. See, I wasn't thinking of depression. I was thinking of helping people. Up, down. Is this a racket, I ask you? Buy low, sell high, buy low, sell high.
I got a job in 1929 as I just graduated from high school as a messenger at Salomon Brothers in Hutzler. I was one of the few people who got out of Wall Street in time because by September 1st I had to go to college. So I got out of Wall Street and was out of it for 4 years. My father was a insurance broker and agent and had a small business with very few employees. And one day he came home, we sat down at dinner, and he said, I just had to fire someone and it's really upset me terribly. And at that point he broke into tears. I had never seen my father cry. You know, in those days, men didn't cry, you know, you weren't supposed to show your feelings or all the nonsense that prevailed. But I've never forgotten that. I mean, it upset him terribly. And that he had to fire this man. And he had to because he didn't have the income, you know, to pay the salary. It was just, or else he couldn't have brought home enough money to feed us.
In 1945, in November, I came back from the war, and I was in my Air Force uniform. Still, I went back home to see my mother and father. We're driving around, and I suddenly look in the corner of the bank, and there I see Mr. X. And I said, hey, hold it up for a minute, will you? I was 23 years old, and I was just in great shape. And I walked into the bank, and I said, Mr. X, do you remember me? And he said, no. What is it? He said, I'm busy. And I said, oh, just this. And I spit. And he stood up, and I hit him. And it was crazy. It was just one of those crazy moments. And I looked around, and I was smiling. And I looked, and everybody was like this. Nobody moved. Nobody stopped me. He was on the floor. I said, that's what you did to my mother and father. It was the most satisfying day of my life. Ever, still to this day.
There was a guy down the street who had a candy store. The candy store was always the center of life. And his name was Joe. He was a very good-looking guy. Always had a smile on his face. He wore nice clothes. And the nice thing about Joe was, in those days, the Daily News was 2 cents. And I think on Sunday it was a nickel or whatever it was. And you came in on Saturday, and you got the Brooklyn section. But you didn't have to pay for the paper until you got there on Sunday. And Joe would always let you have the Brooklyn section, assuming that you would get the rest of the paper on Sunday and pay the rest of the money. So he was like, you know, the sweetest man in the world. One day we woke up, the store was closed. What happened? Joe hung himself. We almost, I mean, really, it still comes back. Why? I don't know, couldn't pay the rent, whatever it was. Those were some of the things that happened, I think, to so many people at that time. Everybody had a story.
From the time that the United States entered the era of the Industrial Revolution, the early 19th century, there were periodic, gigantic swings in the business cycle, and what were called commonly depressions. In the 1830s, the 1850s, the 1870s, the 1890s, a pretty sharp one in 1921, although it was quite brief. So the Great Depression of the 1930s is not all that unfamiliar an episode, except it's grander in scale and it lasts longer than the previous ones. And there has been nothing comparable to it since.
You know, it was just an abysmal event. It was essentially a lost decade. I mean, there's a lot of workers in their prime working years that, you know, lost 10, 12, 15 years of a work history because of that. You know, it's almost like a murder mystery. You know, we all have our favorite whodunits. And the Great Depression is really about, you know, who killed the economy.
There was a whole generation of great economists who were brought into the economics profession precisely because they perceived that something had gone very wrong with our economic system, and they wanted to understand what had gone wrong, and furthermore, try to figure out how to fix it so that sort of thing wouldn't happen again.
And the key to preventing a Great Depression is making your financial institutions fireproof, if you like. You know, it used to be we built our cities entirely of wood, we crowded everybody together, and you could have things like the Great Fire of London at the end of the 17th century. Devastates a huge amount of the city, and a lot of people, you know, lose their belongings, and many of them lose their lives. So you want to build something much more like a modern city, which has different kinds of structures, more fire breaks, more firehouses, more fire engines, and that's what we want to do with our financial system also.
There is no natural process which updates our regulations. Historically, something goes badly wrong, and then we recognize that regulation got behind.
You know, when we have these times of crisis, you know, it's particularly important to think about all of these different dimensions. And I think that most of the economic policy debates have focused on how do you deal with regulating financial markets and so forth. And that's very important, but you need to go beyond that to how do you have a more durable society in which, when crises do happen, you have a better safety net for people's lives.
If you're going to function, you have to be certain about some things. You have to be pretty certain about who you trust, who loves you, where the next meal is going to come from, and what you're going to do if it rains. You have to have that stuff figured out so that you can take risks and grow and all the other things that are so much fun to do. Now, when that stuff gets disturbed, it's physically and emotionally terrible.
There's a wonderful study that research teams went around the country doing these in-depth interviews, and they were trying to discover all kinds of things about how the Depression had affected people psychologically. There was one consistent finding that they found in case after case after case, that the unemployed man felt personally guilty and ashamed and mortified, embarrassed, humbled that he had been put in this situation. Now, we can look back historically and think, well, wait a minute. This unemployed man we're talking about here should have looked around him and seen there were 12,999,999 other people unemployed, and it wasn't that he had suddenly personally failed or lost his moral fiber, but the reflex of all kinds of unemployed people was to blame themselves for their situation and not to blame the system. So this was an impediment to collective political action. It was something Franklin Roosevelt remarked repeatedly to his campaign entourage during the presidential campaign of 1932. He said, this is the worst crisis this country has faced since the Civil War, and why aren't people in the streets? Why aren't they rioting? Why aren't they demanding a political response to this?
In contradiction to the popular notion that the population of America was passive for the most part during the worst days of the Great Depression, the opposite was true. In Chicago, for example, among African Americans, it was not uncommon in the first full year of the Depression, 1930, to find hundreds of black men assembling in Washington Park on the South Side, discussing their plight and what they should do about it. In August of 1931, over 1,000 people, maybe 5,000, marched on a home where a widow was about to be set out by the police and the sheriff's bailiffs. And those thousands of people prevented her furnishings from being put on the street. Unfortunately, there was a scuffle. The police drew their weapons and killed 3 of the demonstrators. Whites joined blacks in a massive march down South State Street that had over 30,000 marchers parade past the funeral home where the bodies of the 3 deceased lay. You tie that in interracial marches with the mid-1930s efforts of labor unions who were organizing in the mass production industries, and you got a blending of interests and the overcoming, temporarily at least, of past racial tensions.
In the 30s, and this sort of sets the stage in the North for Dr. King being able to be successful, we created, in a sense, parallel institutions, parallel social institutions, political institutions, economic institutions, cultural institutions, which gave those of us who were young a feeling that we could have fun, and if we were serious about the future, we'd go to school. Though we were poor, we were not poverty-stricken. And there's a difference. One is a condition in which you happen to be. One is an attitude that one day things are going to change and you're going to be the beneficiary. If you just continue, stay out of trouble, and get the kind of qualifications, educationally and otherwise, that will be needed to change your position. So most of us of that generation at that time did that.
I was born in a house as opposed to a hospital, segregated hospitals. It's a segregated graveyard. So from womb to tomb, we faced segregation. And that meant not only separation, also meant restrictions of access to education and health care and jobs and development. So we lived in the shadows of the Great Depression. So most blacks during that period either knew living grandparents who had been in slavery, or there were many ex-slaves who were still alive. So the least educated, the most vulnerable, took the greatest hit. And it's an intergenerational continuity. People who try to slice and dice history miss the fact that God does not miss one day since you start making days. They're all connected.
So much of the art of the 30s, literature and visual art, is rooted in an interest in understanding what's happening during the Depression, and particularly, at the outset of it, when 25% of Americans were unemployed. And this is a huge number and had a devastating impact on people's lives. And artists were responding to that impact, even the artists who were carried over from the 1920s, like Ernest Hemingway may be the best example of this. Hemingway was writing about individuals during the 1920s and the problems of individuals. In the 1930s, he continues to write these kinds of stories, but then he writes a story about the Spanish Civil War, For Whom the Bell Tolls. And he writes To Have and Have Not, in which the main character concludes after terrible events during the novel, a man alone doesn't have a chance. So there's sense of the collective, the need for other people to depend upon on their fellows is something that comes up in that literature, even in the literature of people like Hemingway who came in from the 20s. It's very obvious in the literature of Steinbeck, of course, who's maybe the preeminent writer, or the one who characterizes and in some ways caricatures the whole culture of the 30s.
One of the few songs at that time that really, at least the Broadway songs, that really hits the Depression full on. I mean, talks about it in no uncertain terms. Brother, Can You Spare a Dime is a very, very powerful song written by Yip Harburg and Jay Gourney. And both were card-carrying communists. I don't say that disparagingly, it's just a fact. But they were in Central Park trying to think of a topic for a song, and they ran across a man, obviously a Harvard-educated, an Ivy League man, but he was down on his luck. He was wearing evening clothes, and he came up to them and surprised them by saying, "Brother, can you spare a dime?" And I thought, that's the great title. That's the way the story goes. But it's a good song, in many ways, great words, and it refers back, of course, to World War I. It's all about a guy who was a soldier in World War I, and you know, the American government really did the dirty on the soldiers, the doughboys who'd fought in World War I. They promised them a bonus at the end of the war. They were getting this money, and they never gave it to them. And of course, in the 1930s, when Hoover was still president, we have the famous bonus army marching right the way across the country and setting up their tents outside the White House, and the army actually being brought in to drive them out. I mean, physically, violently drive them out. But this song directly talks about those soldiers. You know, once in khaki suits, gee, we look swell, full of that Yankee Doodle Dum. 500,000 boots went slogging through hell, and I was the kid with the drum. I like that line. Say, don't you remember, they called me Al. I mean, that's a great detail. They called me Al. It was Al all of the time. Say, don't you remember, I'm your pal. Brother, can you spare a dime? Very powerful song to a minor key Eastern European Jewish melody. I mean, very powerful stuff indeed. But of course, Harburg went on to write a piece of, call it fluff, but certainly an escapist song, Somewhere Over the Rainbow. So, you know, like all great songwriters, they can write all kinds of material.
Oh, we ain't got a barrel of money. Maybe we're ragged and funny, but we'll travel along singing a song side by side. And you know, people went on to sing that song in a very jolly fashion. But actually the words are very touching, and in fact darkly touching. And the verse, which nobody knows, is see that sun in the morning peeking over the hill. I bet you know it always has. I guess it always will. That's how I feel about someone. Somebody feels about me. We know we love each other, and that's the way it'll always be. And then it goes on with the, we ain't got a barrel of money. Maybe we're ragged and funny. We'll travel along singing a song side by side. You know, if I have my honey, you know, we just stick together and have spunk. We'll make it. And it actually comes out of the music even more than I ever realized. You know, I realize in my shows, you know, halfway in, I'll let everybody know, you know, this got everybody through the Depression last time.
Where do you live?
We moved.
From where?
Near my aunt's house. You see, my aunt lived a little bit away from where we used to live. She's a widow. Her husband died. That's how she came to be a widow. The stock market didn't kill him. No, he's one that the stock market didn't kill. He died in September, B.C., before the crash. Very sick man. He had diabetes at 45. That's nothing. I had Chrysler at 110.
Eddie Cantor was really one of the people who really changed our lives, because he was on radio on Sunday nights at 8 o'clock. And when he got on the air during the worst parts of the Depression, when people had no jobs, there was no food on the table, he would sing like, potatoes are cheaper, tomatoes are cheaper, now's the time to fall in love. He was encouraging people to fall in love. Oh, well, that was nice. But he himself had gone through a very tough time. He lost his home, he lost his money, and they were moving furniture out of his house, and he was still able to go on radio and start cheering people up. For those few minutes that we saw those guys do their stuff, the whole world was full of hope.
Say, by cracky, that reminds me of something I forgot to remember. Listen, next time you folks have to give a present to a bride and groom, be sure you make that present an Aladdin kerosene mantle lamp. Now, they can court in the dark before they get married. You know, after a while, they get fed up on it and they need a little light. Had a letter from a fella says here he had a falling out with his gal, and he wrote me, he wanted me to sing I Only Want a Buddy, Not a Sweetheart. I'll sing it for him, but I'll bet $1 he changes his mind. What is romance but taking a chance? Gambling.
So that's a good example of early broadcasts. Now these were called syndicated shows. They're 16-inch transcriptions, each 15 minutes per side. And these were pressed out by whoever put them out for the sponsor. And they were sent out to whatever radio stations subscribed and wanted to play these shows. And this quite obviously was is aimed at a rural population and a population that would be interested in buying lamps because they didn't have electricity at that point. This is a sample of a show from the Coconut Grove Orchestra here in Los Angeles, which was the preeminent nightclub, certainly on the West Coast, and then one of the world's prominent nightclubs. So here's what the better half would be listening to, so to speak.
This enchanting music has thrilled your favorite star and guided their dancing feet in gay fantasy.
While out in the farms, some people had to depend on lamps for their lighting. Here in Los Angeles and other metropolitan centers, even during the depths of the Depression, people were still having a good time. It was not as though the entire population was destitute or anything like that. It certainly affected some people more than others.
My uncle, by the way, was a songwriter at that time. His name was Stanley Damerel, and he was writing in the depths of the 1930s depression in England, and he wrote songs of a complete escapism. One of them is sung today. He wrote Lady of Spain, I Adore You, and Let's All Sing Like the Birdies Sing. And he once explained why he wrote these songs. He said, my partner and I said we couldn't compete with these slick American love songs that always seem to take place on a couch indoors. So my partner and I decided we need to do songs that were about the outside, like Lady of Spain. And my uncle told me that things were so bad that some of his songwriting colleagues, and you have to listen very carefully to this, some of his colleagues were forced to pawn, P-A-W-N, their own underwear, which is something you can't get much lower than that. Pawning your underwear.
Among the rugged peaks that frown down upon the Borgo Pass are found crumbling castles of a bygone age. Hollywood was at that time a little town, a little country town, and it was wonderful. I loved it. The movies kept going and well, people needed something else, and have their minds taken off their tragedy that goes on every day until they get jobs.
Were 6 cents for children and 11 cents for grown-ups. There was a penny tax. And I remember you standing in front of the theaters, and when an adult would go in with their 15 cents, they'd get 4 pennies back. And you'd say, can I have one of your pennies, mister, to get into the movie? And most people gave you the penny, but every now and then some big sport would give you 4 cents. So you were well on your way into the movie. Of course, then once you got in, you opened the door down at the bottom and let 2 or 3 of your friends in. And then there was a scramble always, because when you opened the door, the light from the outside, it was usually during the course it was matinee, the light from outside would come in and the ushers would come scrambling to find the kids who just got in.
There were the coming attractions, which we still have. That's all we have left of the way people used to go to the movies.
But back then they would see short subjects like a comedy short with Laurel and Hardy. They might see a serial chapter, a Western that was continued next week. They might see a newsreel. They would see a cartoon. There were travel logs. There were all sorts of these subjects. And people were just used to that, seeing a whole variety of different shorts, and then the big picture, a full feature.
Movies in the 30s ran the gamut from extreme poverty row things. There were guys making westerns for $900. There were big pictures like Gone with the Wind that were made for multiple millions. Studios were making 40, 50, 60 pictures a year. A star could make 2 or 3 or 4 films a year. Directors the same. So today a filmmaker might make a film every 2 or 3 years, whereas John Ford in 1939, 1940 made 6 major classics that are considered today. Young Mr. Lincoln, Drums Along the Mohawk, Grapes of Wrath, How Green Is My Valley, Stagecoach, all within a very brief span of time.
And, of course, the musicals, too. The Gold Diggers of 1932, the 1933, and all the girls came out, all had blonde hair, and all Busby Berkeley dance routines, very glamorous. And I grew up, and we all did, we all grew up with this fantasy world.
Movies were important. I saw Things to Come, a film by H.G. Wells. It came out in 1936. And when I saw that film, I staggered out of that film. I said, the future is going to belong to me. I'm going to make the future.
Oh, God, is there never to be any age of happiness? Is there never to be any rest? Rest enough for the individual man. Too much and too soon, and we call it death. But for man, no rest and no ending. He must go on, conquest beyond conquest. Poor humanity is so fragile, so weak. Little animals. Little animals. And if we're no more than animals, we must snatch each little scrap of happiness and live and suffer and pass. It is this or that. All the universe or nothingness. Which shall it be, husband? Which shall it be?
Well, one of the things I think that has been misstated about films of the 30s in the past is that the movies provided escapism. And it's true, there were a lot of things like Fred Astaire and musicals and comedies, W.C. Fields and Bob Hope and the Marx Brothers provided escapist entertainment.
What's the show about?
It's all about the Depression.
We won't have to rehearse that.
But there were just as many films, perhaps, that dealt with the reality of the Depression, but they have not been the ones that have been revived, because some of them are pretty grim.
The Wizard of Oz, the book, and especially the movie, were also about monetary policy, about deflation, there not being enough money. So the word Oz is short for ounce. There's the yellow brick road, the gold question, which was so salient in that period. The very dark part in the beginning, the black and white part. That's how people felt about monetary policy. They knew there wasn't enough money, but they also knew, they viewed it as like the weather. There's nothing they could do about it. It was like a storm coming, and they just had to weather it. The character Dorothy, she finds her own way. This disastrous situation, and she manages sort of by luck to slay at least one witch, and then another by cleverness. And she actually manages to tame the wizard. So tame the money, and that was kind of a fantasy.
Everybody points to the 30s as a great golden age of the filmmaking process. But remember that the great filmmakers of the 30s, they had learned their craft in silent films, the craft of visual storytelling. I remember my mentor, Alfred Hitchcock, saying that with the advent of sound, we lost the art form of the moving image.
Talkies came in, there was a greater sense of realism. Silent films had been almost dreamlike in the way they presented their stories, and sound brought a realism to the movies, and you saw that manifested in things like gangster pictures and backstage dramas, and you saw more stories about working class people, as well as fantasy escape things with rich folks in jeopardy.
That look real or just a joke, don't mind them. Roll all your troubles into a cigarette and puff your blues away.
People expected a cartoon with their movie show. You could leave out the newsreel, you could leave out the two-reel comedy, but you had to have a cartoon. In fact, there's a famous 1930s song that's called "What? No Mickey Mouse? What kind of program is this?" And that was a song that was popular because it was a theater didn't show a cartoon. That's what it was about. Disney was moving animation from this what they call rubber hose crazy style of drawing to a more realistic style of storytelling. And all the studios followed Disney. But in the early 30s, the depths of the Depression, those cartoons are particularly like psychedelic. They're mind-blowing.
Mimi, you funny little good-for-nothing Mimi, am I the guy? Mimi.
There's no realism here. And the stories themselves are sort of, these guys were just making it up as they went along. Storytelling, even as in a short cartoon, wasn't sophisticated as it would be 10 years later when they made Bugs Bunny cartoons and Daffy Duck cartoons. In this early 30s period, they might start the story in one place and go outside, and then suddenly they're going somewhere else. They would just came up with these stories, and they would just kind of draw them, free form, stream of consciousness. That's how they look.
My first paycheck is from Walt Disney Studio. I was on Bambi for 3.5 years. So that was never ideal. They didn't pay me very much, but then I loved the job. Going back to the WA, I remember Senator McDonald Wright, he was the director. I bought my painting and showed it to him. So we get paid $96 a month. So you turn in 2 oil painting and 2 watercolor, or else 4 lithograph. So that's like getting to the WA. That's a good thing. That saved a lot of artists, from starving debt.
The sensitive fingers of artists are poorly suited to manual labor. And in finding suitable work for musicians and other artists, the WPA has contributed greatly to the culture of America. Painters, too, contribute their bit to making the Works program a real and permanent accomplishment. These reproductions of the American scene of today will make this one of the most fertile periods of our country's art. Some of this work is done on canvas, but much of it is created on the walls of our schools, libraries, and other public buildings in the form of mural paintings.
The fact that the government would experiment with the idea of putting creative people to work and getting a public good out of it was really piloted here at Coit Tower in San Francisco. It really was the pilot program that helped to launch the WPA, the Works Progress Administration's use of artists. So the 26 artists who got involved and were commissioned to create these murals here at Coit Tower were really the pioneers, the experiment that worked, and then it allowed public art to spread across the whole country. It's a school of art called social realism, and that's most of what's depicted in these murals. And social realism was really about capturing everyday life and helping to tell the story of the average person, as opposed to just what the news and the media would sort of highlight back then and even today, which is the story of the great man, right? The captains of industry.
And there is an opportunity of creating community when you deal with a lot of public art. And that's certainly been the philosophy of many of the murals that have been commissioned by the Arts Commission over the years here in San Francisco.
We are at Lucy Flower High School, and this is the foyer of the school. And this mural was created between 1938 and 1940 by Edward Millman. He was an artist that was on the WPA, and he wanted to create a mural about outstanding American women. And at the same time, he was studying a lot about the Mexican muralist movement. And prior to creating this, he had actually gone to Mexico and studied with Diego Rivera in 1934. So when he was sort of building the agenda for this image, he wanted to really promote that kind of social realism within this sort of temple that you see here. It took him 2 years to complete this image, and then 1 year later, it was deemed by the Board of Education as misery-laden and depressing, so they whitewashed it 1 year later. This image is probably the most controversial in the city of Chicago because it was so heavy, and it was talking about so many core truths to what was happening at the time. And you know, the important thing to remember is artists are like a barometer of what's happening. They record what's going on, they tell these stories in creative and imaginative ways, and when that kind of philosophical and intellectual creativity is covered up, that's something that is really hard to take. So when you walked into this room, it was completely white in 1996. And so we did test after test to try to figure out how to unveil this powerful image. It was a pretty magical time for us. That was in 1997, and it took us about 9 months to move throughout this entire room. And then we had an unveiling ceremony, and it was all about unveiling the history that it encapsulated. So yes, it was very precious to all of us involved, and remains so.
And one of the main themes that emerges in the arts of the 30s and the whole culture of the 30s is the one that Hemingway eventually comes to, that the individual alone doesn't have a chance. And so this idea that people need other people, that the individual can be broken but then maybe stronger, but so much of the art of the period was moving toward a sense, and the politics of the period, moving toward a sense of the necessity politically for empathy, for care, for brotherhood, for collective action, whether it's in strikes or in the implementation of a social security system. At the same time, it's also strongly resisted by a whole other political set. So the 30s becomes a really polarized period politically, between these collectivist notions and the notions of the individual that are still fairly strong in this country.
You and you and you and you've got a president now. He gave the land a new deal. You hold the cards, now you deal. You and you and you and you put shoulders to the plow. He gave us what we asked for, now pay him back somehow. Step out in front, get back of the president, and give a man a job.
Franklin Roosevelt's achievement is all the more remarkable because he had not only to invent the tools with which to fight the Depression, but he had to convince people that it was legitimate to do anything at all. And there were a lot of people who were very, very skeptical that there was anything that should be done here other than just let the thing go down the drain and eventually it would take care of itself.
There was a woman named Lorena Hickok
that was employed by the Roosevelt administration to go around the country and write reports about how people were dealing with the economic difficulties. And you know what she really came to say, and especially like in the Farm Belt and in different parts of the country, is that she saw this kind of prevailing sense of despair. You know, people were becoming apathetic, you know, and I think to a certain extent, you know, the New Deal did play a role in kind of letting people know, you know, we're not going to let things continue on as they have been. You know, we are going to try and improve the situation, and I think that meant a lot to a lot of people.
Well, I remember sitting by the radio, the whole family, sitting by the radio listening to a fireside chat, you know, Roosevelt.
Yes, it's my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
There's your doctor.
Mr. President, what will cure a depression?
Confidence! And lick this old depression. Confidence! Hey, hey! It's our salvation. Preach it, shout it, shout it. Confidence! Just have confidence. Wake up, open up the door. Take this right gold, we'll come back with more. Yesterday there were skies of gray, but today is another day. Brewing, we'll all get a break. New day's dawning for worker and drone. No more bumming, we'll all get to work. There's a new day dawning now.
I think we'll win out, not because of a government, not even because of our leaders, but because as a people we've had a vision, and we've worked for it, and we've seen it through. Okay.
The President of the United States, inspired, by the way, by his wife, Eleanor, at least, often I say inspired, directed by Eleanor, tended to want to give to the community greater opportunities than they had enjoyed.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
It opened thoughts, opportunities about, out of the New Deal, can we begin to create a real deal?
Some people felt that FDR was the closest thing keeping us from having a revolution in this country. In other words, he was providing work with the WPA and all these different projects that if that would have happened, there are those who contended we would have had a bloody revolution. So you had a lot of social unrest at that time, not like it was necessarily over in Europe, but you had people that were out of work, they were hungry, that they looked at fascism or communism, and that gave them a chance, an opportunity maybe to climb up the ladder. Maybe there's something wrong with our system. Maybe we ought to do that. So you saw that even at that time as a little youngster. I remember arguments between my father and other people about political things like that, dealing not so much about Washington politics, but what the situation would have to be. We'd have to go the European route. In other words, either fascism or communism, because that's the way to do things right.
The New Deal, for all of its historical consequence, it failed to end the Great Depression. But it did something else, and it did something, I think, that was part of a very high-level, visionary political calculus that Roosevelt had in mind. It used the moment of this enduring crisis to put in place a set of major reforms, of institutional rearrangement of the whole social and economic landscape that stabilized the economy once it recovered with World War II, and provided the lattice work or the scaffolding on which the American economy and indeed the international economy grew like crazy for a half century after World War II.
You're always going to have boom and bust. You don't want, and you may even have panics to some degree, but you don't want those to become big depressions, meaning output goes down quite a lot and then stays down and you struggle to recover. You lose a decade. You can lose a decade. And we know from the Japanese experience recently, it can happen even today in relatively rich countries. So I don't think there should be any presumption that we've grown out of depressions, right? Maybe we've learned some things about how to avoid them, maybe we haven't. I mean, that's what the discussion should really focus on.
It was crisis. It was meltdown. We feared that all the financial sector, banks and security firms may go down.
The lost decade is a period of extremely low economic growth for the Japanese economy. So the business were not doing very well in general.
The sort of norm was that after you graduate from college and you go for a large firm, and large firm will keep you for life. So you are on the track and you can plan your life at the age of 22. That was a sort of typical picture.
Because of the lifetime employment system, they cannot fire the core workers. So what the many Japanese companies did during the lost decade of the 1990s is to keep the core employees, keep the workers on the lifetime employment system, but stopped hiring.
So the first hit was not the company employees, but the fresh out of college. They couldn't find, this famous lifetime employment.
We made a lost generation. Belonging to some community or organization, it might be family or company or school, whatever, is very important. Very important. And actually, corporation did a very important role. Japanese companies are heavily in charge of the sustaining many social security or so on and so forth, practically, rather than government itself. But the lost generation didn't have a chance to belong to that kind of community.
僕は今35歳なんですね。それで20年前っていうと中学生高校生ですけど、その時はまだこういうなんていうのかな、衰えていくというかっていう気配は日本の中にはなかったんで、例えば学校で社会科の教科書を見ると、その日本のその経済力の指標みたいのはひたすら上がり続けている感じだったんですよね。で僕らはそれを見てるからこのまま上がり続けるのかなみたいに思う部分であって、でそれは学校卒業してそういう状況っていうのは完全に終わったんですね。
Stability of the society, or stable, healthy growth or development of the society, we have to rebuild that kind of community. So that's a real challenge. But the answer is not simply getting back to the old system. We have to rebuild the concept of the corporation. We have to rebuild the concept of the employment or labor. So that's a real challenge. So we really need this sort of a destructive, creation.
What we can clearly see now is to avoid what happened in Japan, to avoid a lost decade here in the United States, which at this point may or may not be unavoidable, really, honestly, is that we need a massive injection, a continued massive injection of economic stimulus. The question is, where is this going to come from? The economy has 4 basic areas that we have that drive economic growth. In the United States, about 70% of economic growth comes from consumers. Well, consumers have declining home values, declining stock portfolios, and 1 in 10 of them nearly is out of a job. So that's really not going to be a place where we're going to see a lot of demand growing in the short to medium term. Until jobs come back, consumption is not going to drive our economy forward. It's not where we're going to see our recovery, and that's 70% of our economy. So we got to make up for that big chunk someplace else. The other 3 places we can look to are business investment, export growth, and government spending. Businesses aren't going to invest until they see consumers, so there's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem going on there. Exports are up a little bit, but still it's a relatively small share of our overall economy, so it's not clear how that relatively small share can pull the whole U.S. economy out. And then the last place we can look is in terms of government spending to create economic demand. That's exactly what we did during the Great Depression, and it's something that we haven't really needed in the same way that we need it now at any point since the Great Depression.
I think we progress in lurches. I think we lurch forward. I think we adopt a set of rules and a vocabulary and a standard for truth, and that serves us well. This is certainly true in science. It serves us well right up until the moment where all of a sudden it isn't working, and the whole world comes apart. We don't know how to change it gradually. We just have to wait for the iceberg. And then a wonderful thing happens. The world falls apart. And we are able to stand there and say, what are we really trying to do here? What is our world really like?
One of our most important resources in this country is our creativity, and that if we can really kind of deploy that, I think in many respects the answers to kind of working ourselves out of these economic troubles may not come from the Congress or the House of Representatives or big corporations or the Federal Reserve, but it may be something things that go on in people's garages, things like sustainable living tips, alternative currencies. We're going to see a lot of things happening on the ground that are going to be kind of important innovations. I think it's kind of an inborn American trait that we have a tendency to kind of tinker and innovate when we're not happy with existing or outdated systems.
If you look historically, a lot of strong businesses were started during a downturn in the economy, during the Great Depression or other recessions we've had. But I was an investment banker working 90 hours a week. I'd never have the time to launch something like that. Well, once I got laid off, schedule opened up, and I thought, well, now's as good a time as any. All jobs seem to be so hard to get now that I think you're seeing people really just go after where their passions are, as opposed to, well, this is where the money is. So I think you're seeing a number of paradigm shifts, more so than before, and shift in values, I think. And my hope is that they'll last, so that there'll be more of a gap between these boom and bust periods. And so we'll see. People tend to have short memories, I think, particularly when times do start to turn around.
Welcome to New York City, financial capital of the world. Welcome to Wall Street, the heart of American capitalism. I was a former vice president at Deutsche Bank. There I helped manage $1 billion trading business. The crisis displaces a lot of people. I lost my job. It's Adam Smith's invisible hand smacking me around and putting me to a different area of the economy. But for me, I'm really happy with what I'm doing now, showing people Wall Street, telling my story. I love to teach. Some people find inspiration. They're saying, hey, here's a guy making lemonade out of lemons. Other people say, hey, here's a trader that's been downgraded to a tour guide. It's two different ways to look at it.
2 years ago, I was fully infiltrated in the financial industry, which I loved and adored and had been doing since I graduated from college. And as time passed, I started to see everything going on in the financial markets, just huge blow-ups. I then, in fact, got my pink slip and ended up being laid off. And I often remember my mom saying, the farm is what saved her parents during the Depression. They also did, crazy stuff, sell moonshine, I guess, and, house different people coming over from Europe that needed extra housing and put them up but always kind of like thinking of different ways of being smart and making money and saving their money. I worked really hard in finance, but I'm working a lot harder now than I ever worked in finance, you know, for nothing basically, or, you know, hopefully to potentially attain something. But it's a return to intelligence and creativity and, you know, this emergence of young entrepreneurs with socially conscious types of businesses. We're all kind of like bartering with one another of how to get work done and how to, you know, get a fashion show done with no capital. Well, this person needs this exposure and I need this, and let's like figure out a way to make this happen. So yeah, it's an interesting time, and it's also like something great to be a part of, I feel.
Fang, my husband, Fang, was so cheap that once he took the kids and me out for coffee and donuts. The kids loved it because they had never given blood before. What a joke. That's a beautiful joke. In retrospect, it may look like a great thing that happened that was a necessity to get us back on the track properly. Because, after all, we, each of us, are a part of human evolution. And we take with us technology. And we're speeding into the universe.
Your experience that you had coming through those times sustain you. They make you strong. You're tested in the crucible of a fire.
The Depression beat people down. So it was wonderful and romantically to say, look at how these people pulled themselves up and made something of themselves. But there's also that other half of the population that couldn't do that were so beaten down by the Depression that it affected their mindset and people around them and their families for years and years to come. So unless you have that courage to keep on, and those early days in the Depression days molded a lot of people and gave them the courage and the strength to become somebody.
I would not say it makes us stronger. I would say it makes us free. It makes us more confident when it's all over. It makes us confident in our ability to survive. That part of it is true. But it doesn't make our beliefs stronger. It usually destroys them. It doesn't make our family systems stronger. It usually injures them. It doesn't make our economic system stronger or our political system stronger. It usually wrecks it. So I don't think in those senses that it made us stronger. I think what it did was force us to think freely and anew about our lives and the way we're going to judge truth, the way we communicate to each other, the people we're willing to trust and not trust. I think it's a moment of enlightenment. Now, it's usually accompanied by nausea.
We're so often saved in spite of ourselves, you know. Something Arnold Toynbee, a great historian, said that his lifelong study of, and he was no mystic, he was a very practical man. He said his lifelong study of history had led him to the conclusion that every time the puddle of human affairs was about to congeal completely, the finger of God comes down and stirs it. And I thought, it seems like that sometimes.
One of the beauties of that period was that though we had no money of any large, except for that small upper 5 or 6% of the population who were jumping out of windows, committing suicide because they couldn't take it. We had ways to take it. And that, again, is a factor that is a part of the American life, the American dream, is that we can take it because it's going to get better.